On behalf of Westminster College and America's National Churchill Museum, I declare this convocation, the 37th Annual Enid and R. Crosby Kemper Lecture, open. Please remain standing for the invocation.
Please join me in prayer. Holy Spirit, we ask your presence be known in this gathering of our Churchill Fellows. Lord God, we ask that their lives and works be a testament to your enduring call for peace, love, and reconciliation. Almighty One, you have reminded us through your servant Churchill that we are to mobilize our words and deeds for the liberation of all people, even when there seems no hope of victory. Heavenly Father, navigate us through today's gathering storms, that we may find safe harbor in the kingdom to come. In all these things we give thanks, asking blessings in your holy name, and all the people say, Amen.
Churchill Fellows, fellow inductees, faculty, students, staff, alumni, trustees, honored guests, and friends, good morning and welcome to our campus and museum communities. My name is Don Lofi, and I have the privilege and honor of being the president of this humble institution. Since its famous visit to our college in 1946, countless individuals and organizations, including the Association of Churchill Fellows and the International Churchill Society, have helped to preserve Winston Churchill's legacy, a legacy that is lasting and relevant. This magnificent museum is a world-class collection, and this extraordinary building are among Westminster's greatest treasures. When Churchill came to Westminster College 79 years ago, no one, save perhaps for Churchill himself, could have predicted the profound impact his speech that he gave on campus that day would have on world affairs. Shortly after the Iron Curtain speech, President Truman wrote a short letter to my predecessor, Westminster College President Frank McClure. In his letter, Truman said of Churchill's speech, "It will certainly put Fulton on the map." It did and still does. As president as he was, even Churchill might be surprised, and no doubt pleased, that nearly 8 decades on, we gather here annually to reflect upon and learn from his extraordinary life. I hope Churchill would be delighted to know of the continuing investments in Westminster College in making of his legacy. In recent years, these investments have been made most visible as we've worked to preserve the museum and its remarkable church, about which those who were with us yesterday learned a great deal about. However, our investments go far beyond bricks and mortar. Churchill might take pleasure in seeing the galleries filled with skilled children, learning about the Second World War, the Cold War, the importance of international alliances to promote liberty and democracy in the United States and the United Kingdom and many places beyond. Churchill also might be pleased to know that today's Westminster College students and faculty continue to explore and expand upon his idea and ideals in and outside the classroom. Churchill, too, would take great pleasure in seeing how many statesmen and other dignitaries and stateswomen have followed in his steps to Fulton and to this campus. The litany of speakers is long. U.S. presidents, prime ministers, health and major and individuals, and of course, Lady Thatcher, who made the journey here to the America's heartland to share her wisdom and insights on global affairs. All of this is Churchill's legacy at Westminster College. On occasions like today, and at the time when the world faces numerous challenges and new challenges, but those opportunities as well, we are reminded that Churchill's relevance continues to be of vital importance. The Association of Churchill Fellows and the Enid and R. Crosby Kemper Lectureship continue to inform us and inspire us. For that, we are truly grateful. And so, on behalf of the Westminster College community and the museum community, thank you for being with us this morning. Now I'm pleased to welcome to the lectern our Deputy Senior Fellow, Westminster alumnus, Board Trustee, and Vice Chair of the Board, Neil Perryman. Neil?
Thank you, Don. Good morning, everyone. I'm extremely honored to stand here today as a proud Westminster College alumni. It's a great pleasure to take place in these wonderful activities today. I have the privilege to be with you today as the Deputy Senior Fellow of the Association of Churchill Fellows, standing in for the Senior Fellow, Philip Beckman, who sends his regards from London. St. Mary, the Virgin Aldermanbury is a remarkable place. It's an eyewitness to history. The earliest records of this church date back to the 12th century. Even then, the foundations were built along Roman ruins dating 1,000 years earlier. If these walls could talk, that old saying takes on new meaning here for sure. These well-traveled stones, now more than 4,000 miles from their original place, have seen wars, plagues, floods, and fires. Shakespeare lived a block away from this church. John Milton was married in this church. When Churchill learned of Westminster College's audacious idea to move these stones to this place in the middle of Missouri, he was moved. It was a sort of very bold and, again, audacious idea that he was famous for and admired. This place is also an extraordinary symbol of the long-standing and strong Anglo-American relationship. That relationship, which is forged in democracy, freedom, liberty, and the rule of law, was something Churchill admired and fought for, as we all know. So I say again, I'm very honored to stand here today in this hallowed place. Over the years, as President Lofi mentioned, we've welcomed veterans, scholars, statesmen, stateswomen, captains of industry, leaders in the arts and sciences, and yes, even a few of us lawyers, and we'll have a few more today. But all these folks share a common bond. Again, a belief in the power of liberty and democracy and are extraordinary champions of the legacy of Winston Churchill. On his behalf, and on behalf of the Board of Governors of the Association of Churchill Fellows and the Board of Trustees of Westminster College, I now have the honor of formally inducting our new Churchill Fellows. I kindly ask that all the fellow inductees please stand. This class of fellows is an extremely distinguished group. All have admired and supported Sir Winston Churchill over the years in their professional and personal endeavors. These folks are leaders in their communities. I invite you to read more about their impressive backgrounds and accomplishments in the printed program. So I welcome you all into the Association of Churchill Fellows at this time. We know that you'll wear your medallion and scarlet ribbon with pride and in turn represent this special place with honor. And I'm going to read their names, and then Tim will put their medals on. Sir Conor Burns. Senator Josh Hawley was inducted, or voted to be inducted, but he was unfortunately unable to be with us today. He's probably a little busy, but he sends his regrets. Julia Holofcener. Bob Kelly. Judith Miller. And Kent Miller. Our next inductee is David Richardson. This is being awarded to him posthumously. His wife, Suzanne, is here, and accepting on his behalf is his son, Ted, a Westminster College alum. Louis Riggs. John Shapercutter. Ladies and gentlemen, fellows, and honored guests, I present to you for one more round of applause our newest inductees into the Association of Churchill Fellows. I now invite Tim Riley to introduce our speaker. Tim?
Well, thank you, Neil, President Lofi, fellows, new fellows. It's really an honor and privilege on this occasion every year to welcome to our campus a distinguished speaker. We have had a long line of legendary lecturers here at Westminster College, not the least among them, Sir Winston Churchill. And I'm reminded, before I introduce today's speaker, of the story. In 1945, some of you know the history. World War II ended. The Allies were victorious. Winston Churchill, on May 8th, on VE Day, famously gave a speech from the balcony at Whitehall, telling the British people, "This is your victory," with his famous victory salute. The people responded, "No, this is yours." Well, a few months later, there was a general election. Winston Churchill's party lost. He won the war, he lost an election, he was out of the job. His wife Clementine famously tried to console Sir Winston, saying, "Winston, I think this is a blessing in disguise," to which he cleverly said, "It's very effectively disguised." Churchill's loss was Westminster College's gain. Churchill's loss was the world's gain. For the speech that Churchill gave in the gymnasium on the top of the hill on our campus nearly 80 years ago changed the world. His Sinews of Peace was a blueprint for Anglo-American alliance to promote the values of liberty and democracy and freedom throughout the world. Churchill warned of an iron curtain descending across the continent. But more importantly, he lifted up the value of liberty and peace. Since then, we've gathered on this campus, either in the historic gymnasium or more recently in this hallowed space, to hear from speakers who have their own insights on world affairs and geopolitics. And today's Enid and R. Crosby Kemper Lecturer, Sir Conor Burns, is the latest in the list of those who will address us. Now, when I first met Sir Conor a little over a year ago in London, he was a distinguished member of Parliament. He was a trade minister for the British government. But like Churchill before him, he faced an election last year and unfortunately lost his seat. I think, Sir Conor, for us, it was a blessing in disguise. He could have chosen to be anywhere in the world, and today he's chosen to be with us. Sir Conor served as Prime Minister's trade envoy to the United States for trade and investment. He was also appointed to the Privy Council by Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II. I think there are few more distinguished statesmen better to address us on the geopolitics of the day and to reflect upon Winston Churchill's legacy, not only then, but also in the future, than Sir Conor Burns. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sir Conor Burns.
Tim, thank you for that very kind and generous introduction. One always feels on these occasions that there's a little extra line added to one's obituary each time a new introduction is made. I'd like to begin by saying to each and every one of you the two most underused words in the English language: thank you. Thank you for having me here, but much more importantly than that, thank you for the contribution each of you make individually and collectively here at Westminster College, at the museum, the International Churchill Society, as fellows, as donors, as supporters, in keeping the legacy and inspiration of Sir Winston Churchill alive to future generations. I join you from a place that could have had a very profound impact on the Churchill Society, on the Churchill Museum, a place that could have meant, in a very real sense, that there would never have been a Churchill Museum or a Churchill Society. There would never have been the famous speech here at Fulton. That place is called Bournemouth. It was my constituency. Churchill, in his 1930 memoir, My Early Life, wrote, "My aunt, Lady Wimborne, had lent us her comfortable estate at Bournemouth for the winter. 40 or 50 acres of pine forest descended by sandy undulations terminating in cliffs to the smooth beach of the English Channel. It was a small, wild place, and through the middle there fell to sea level a deep cleft called a chine." Churchill relayed the story of playing with his cousins and his 12-year-old brother. He ran onto a rustic bridge nearly 50 yards across the chine. They were playing a game of catch, and rather than face capture by his playmates at either end of the bridge, Churchill jumped, intending to slide down one of the pines to the ground. Instead, he fell the full height. He carries on in his memoirs to say, "It was 3 days before I regained consciousness, and more than 3 months before I crawled from my bed. The measured fall was 29 feet on the hard ground. I visited the pharmacy in Westbourne near my home when I was still in Parliament and was shown the original dispensing book that showed the medicines that were prescribed for Churchill and the penicillin that was thrown in to his wounds to keep him alive. And it really was touch or go." Later, Bournemouth played another significant part in the Churchill journey, for it was from Bournemouth at the Labour Party conference where Clement Attlee was in town when Neville Chamberlain rang to propose a coalition government, a call that Attlee took in what is now the Town Hall in Bournemouth. He accepted a coalition, but as is now well documented, his price was that it could not be led by Chamberlain. And so he set in train the events that led to Churchill becoming Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So almost a year ago, I had my own experience of similarly descending undulations, terminating at a leisure centre where I too fell into a deep cleft. It was called defeat in a general election. Tim has recounted the story of Lady Churchill saying that Winston's defeat might have been a blessing in disguise. My friends, I tell you in sincerity, I have embraced my defeat, and I have never felt happier. I am free to think again, free to pose solutions to difficult challenges in a way that contemporary politics doesn't allow. I wouldn't swap a second of my time in the House of Commons, but nor do I regret the curtain coming down on that period. The cynicism today about contemporary politics grows deeper and deeper. In many ways, it's not new. I remember years ago when I was campaigning for the local council in Southampton, knocking on a door and explaining that I was the Conservative candidate and asking if the gentleman who'd answered the door would support me. And he said, "Before I answer that question, young man," in those days I could be called young man, he said, "I have a question for you." I said, "Sir, please go ahead." He said, "Is it true that local councillors don't pay council tax?" I said, "Well, goodness, no, of course. They pay council tax in exactly the same way as everyone else." And he looked at me and said, "Well, it strikes me if you can't do anything for yourself, you won't be able to do very much for me." But seriously, being outside Parliament has given me time to think, time to do things that politics denied, time to be with family, with my brothers, with friends, time to think, time to reflect, time to read. And very personally and deeply, very precious time with my father, who died in January. I never missed a single Christmas Eve doing the second reading in the service of 9 lessons at the Mother Church in Bournemouth, the second reading after the Mayor. This year, freed from that, I was able to spend my father's last Christmas with him in Spain. The blessing is not disguised. The blessing is in plain sight. But it was a great privilege to be in Parliament. The sense of walking in to that chamber, knowing that you represented your fellow men and women in a defined geographic area of your shared country, was an enormous privilege, a privilege that Churchill understood, which is why he cleaved to membership of the House of Commons for so very long. I quoted in a speech I gave on the eve of Britain leaving the European Union in January 2020, a story about Churchill that was relayed in the biography by Macmillan Scott of Churchill, the turn of the 20th century, turning to a colleague, and he said, "As we were leaving the House last night, he called me into the Commons to take a last look round. All was darkness except a ring of faint light around the gallery. We could dimly see the tables, but the walls and roof were invisible. Look at it," said Churchill. "This little place is what makes the difference between us and Germany. It is in the virtue of this that we shall muddle through to success, and for lack of this, Germany's brilliant efficiency leads her to final destruction. This little room is the shrine of the world's liberties. That remained true for so very long. But is it true anymore? Are Churchill's words that he wrote in the article in 1931, 50 years hence, really now coming to pass? Where he said, "Great nations are no longer led by their ablest men, or by those who know most about their immediate affairs, or even those who have a coherent doctrine. Democratic governments drift along the line of least resistance, taking short views, paying their way with sops and doles, and smoothing their path with pleasant-sounding platitudes. Never was there less continuity or design in their affairs, and yet towards them are coming swiftly changes which will revolutionize for good or ill not only the whole economic structure of the world, but the social habits and moral outlook of every family." Churchill understood that the affairs of nations were in the hands of great men and great women, people of foresight. Churchill, let us be honest, always saw himself, long before many others, as being in that category. He wrote in 1925, "I have no hesitation in ranging myself with those who view the past history of the world mainly as the tale of exceptional human beings whose thoughts, actions, and qualities, virtues, triumphs, weaknesses, and crimes have dominated the fortunes of the race." That was written even before this country was lucky enough to have a president who has made the best start to a presidency ever, better even than George Washington, as he told the State of the Union. Churchill was always thinking, speaking, and writing about the future. Indeed, that's why we are here today in this place. One speech out of office almost 80 years ago, and here we are gathered in this place. Today I want to look back and forward. Tim was pressuring me for a title to the speech, and no one could possibly top the title that Churchill gave his speech here, World Peace. I thought about a title such as Western Civilization is the Iron Lady the Fat Lady about to sing. Because I do want to submit to you that today we are in a place of clear and present danger, and we are in danger of squandering beyond recovery everything our forebears held dear. We have taken our inheritance of the shining city on the hill, teeming with a population enjoying shared bonds of history and sentiment, of growing prosperity and reassuring security, and we are in danger of imperiling it all. The greatest threat that we face today, all of us, is ourselves. Churchill famously fought Hitler, but he first fought self-doubt. By failing to address fundamental questions, Western civilization is in danger of leaving its battlements unarmed. There are people at the gate, and we are inviting them in, who wish us harm. We have abandoned the cultural premises and have eroded them at three crucial junctions of society that I wish to address this morning: the economy, our laws and our orders, and finally, the body politic itself. Let's begin in context. Everything substantive and meaningful that we hold dear, this church and all it represents, this college and her counterparts around the free world, our cultural inheritance, the family unit, established institutions, the law, and even democracy itself is the synthesis of Western thought. For centuries, the intellectual tradition of the Western world was a bold and noble pursuit, a search for truth, for order, for an understanding of the self, all rooted in reason, virtue, and springing from the divine. Out of this cornucopia sprung the highest ideals of art, of architecture, of literature, of music, of what, in short, we call society. From Platonic forms to Aristotelian ethics, the harmony of faith and reason in Aquinas to the Enlightenment's defense of liberty and human dignity, Western philosophy sought meaning. It sought to answer the great questions. Who are we? Why are we here? What is good? What is true? These were matters that intensely interested Churchill. Writing in 1931, Churchill posed the question to past ages of men, but what was the good of all that to them? What did they know more than we know about the answers to simple questions which man has asked since the earliest dawn of reason? Why are we here? What is the purpose of life? Whither are we going? Our society formed accordingly, but we could never fully find the answers because we are human and falling. But by continuing in this tradition, it only ever got closer to fulfilling them. Take democracy and this very country, where Jefferson could inscribe those immortal words that all men are created equally and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, those being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Only in America could Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner, write those words knowing full well that in his time and himself would not live up to them. But he trusted that one day this fledgling nation would, and indeed it did, live up to its calling, because uniquely America was the only country ever literally born in freedom. Now, I'm not advocating the flawed historicist narrative of endless progress. Instead, defending our objectives' truths and noting that our ideology best serves them, because our ideology is remarkably unideological. It is an ideology of practicality. The Enlightenment was the practical application of classical thought, virtue, natural rights, and reason in institutional systems which understand our fixed human nature could implement them. It was both grounded in what works as well as running with the grain of human nature. It was not mere coincidence or accident that it found its form in the Judeo-Christian world, where biblical virtues had already taken root. But we must accept that our principles are not as alluring as the certainty of Marxism, its cultural Frankenstein equivalent, and thus, reflective of ourselves, it can never be perfect. And it was in that Achilles heel that our enemies saw exploitable weaknesses. And goodness, my friends, how have they exploited them? The rise of deconstructionism and postmodern thought has not merely questioned these foundations, it has worked to dismantle them. We've been left with a world where meaning is unstable, the self is a construct, and truth, once the guiding star of philosophy, is now treated as a relic of a bygone age. Identity becomes performance, morality becomes relative. The individual is no longer formed in pursuit of the good, but broken down by fragments of social forces and language games. Truth can now even be personalized and described as my truth. First, the tantalizing lure of historicism, and later Marxist dialectic thought pervaded our institutions, and in doing so, our economists began to move leftward. after transforming the very idea of the state, they have come for our culture. They begin seemingly with benign intentions. Surely everything deserves some degree of scrutiny. It began with our history. The supreme arrogance of judging the people and events of the past, Churchill included, through the prism of contemporary values. As though those values, hand in hand but not often in fairness with veganism, were the principles of humankind, most definitely not now, mankind's development. We've seen this most clearly at our universities, and it is reaching its fully developed form. This was seen by others a long time ago. In 1996, in a lecture she delivered in London, Margaret Thatcher said this: "Closely linked to this approach is the obsessive political correctness that imperils serious scholarship in so many American universities and colleges. Concepts like truth and falsehood, beauty and ugliness, civilization and barbarism have been deconstructed to give way to judgments based on ideology. The results would be funny if the consequences were not so serious. Whole shelf loads of classics written by what they call DWEMs, dead white European males, are nowadays consigned to the dustbin of whatever these people now call history. The great Milton is now, in the words of a Stanford University English professor, regarded as an ass and a sexist pig. Shakespeare is still on the syllabus of Duke University, but in the words of one professor, only to illuminate the way the 17th century society mistreated women, the working classes, and minorities." Lady Thatcher continued, "All this can be called many things: collectivism, relativism, multiculturalism, or just good old-fashioned stupidity. But it also provides a new ideological basis for socialism, for in the upside-down world of political correctness is one in which strategies of social control, the enduring objective of the left, are given free rein." My friends, universities, the cathedrals of learning, should be bastions of free speech, and where the right to cause offense indifference should be ingrained. In passing, it may be more than a coincidence that in Churchill we find a genius to rouse a nation who was able to do so without, maybe even because of, a university education. We need to return to that old principle so brilliantly laid out by the late Master of the Rolls, Lord Denning, who said, "Two reasonable people may perfectly reasonably reach opposite conclusions based on the same set of facts, without each surrendering their right to be considered a reasonable person." The small failures in our grand Western project have been exploited and aggrandized at the expense of all of us. There are always new approaches, new studies, new movements, new isms, but they all amount to the same thing: the destruction of everything for the sake of nothing. When one hears the siren call of socialism, we cannot help but turn our ear. It speaks to the heart's longing for justice, for peace, yet beneath its gentle lullaby lies a quieter cost: the dimming of ambition's fire, the quiet surrender of liberty to the machinery of the state, the forceful reconstruction of self. In its quest to make all things given, it grinds the peaks down to the valleys, mistaking our sameness for fairness. Soulless ideology has brought down to the lowest common denominator. No single hierarchy or distinction remains unscathed, other than that of the unstoppable project. It is why uniform, our standards of dress, why manners and etiquette have faded into that denounced, oft prejudiced past. It is why the canon gathers dust in the academy, why parental discipline is shrinking. It is why we have shunned the strong, the smart, and the hard-working. It is why we find the concept of responsibility now so difficult. No hierarchy is free from its scathing eye, for socialism is the conqueror's call. But we must remember that when the dust settles, the builder is preferable to the swordsman. And it is in the careful conservatism that societies build themselves into great civilizations. I want to turn for a moment to the economy. The free market places the individual and, crucially, millions and millions of individuals at its beating heart. It is the practical, most effective and efficient manner by which we organize ourselves. Capitalism, hand in hand with democracy, best allows to liberate the individual from their most base requirements so that we may stride on the path of individual and collective virtue. It is where the two base forces in our lives, the collective and the individual, come together. Forces that on the surface can appear contradictory, but yet the flourishing of one should not, although reason would suggest it should, require the slaying of the other. They require each other symbiotically. Without individual success, what is society, given that it is merely a conservation of collective outcomes of individual action? The lower quality the parts, the worse the manufacturing, the lower the quality of the product. It is the state's fundamental responsibility to create the framework in which the God-given talents and abilities of the people can properly and freely flourish, to create the right framework of law for enterprise. Every human being is fundamentally motivated by a determination to improve theirs and their family's lot. It is why people will work hardest when they see the link between risk and reward and effort and return. Mrs. Thatcher put this very well in repudiating the idea that the economic model that puts the individual at its heart is somehow selfish. She made the point, man may climb Everest for himself, but at the summit, he plants his country's flag. In other words, the nation is enriched when millions of individuals are set free to pursue their own ambitions and their own destiny. But we should not forget for a moment that our system has its flaws, and these flaws have become manifest in recent years. For the last half-century, America and the United Kingdom have overseen a managed manufacturing decline. The conventional opinion from all establishment economists has been to promote free trade, shift towards a service economy, and import everything else from other parts of the world. But the notion of free trade has left some communities behind, and it has relied on a theory that no longer in some ways works, that all trading partners are operating to similar understanding of the rules. We have to, in some ways, reimagine what our trading system and our economic model looks like in these circumstances if we are to bring everyone with us. The orthodoxy taught in all universities now of specialization in international trade for increasing overall production of goods in the world, unmitigated free trade opening new markets and new frontiers for the development of the world, does not necessarily deliver for the communities that, crucially, politicians have to respond to. America and the world are not synonymous. Progress for one does not necessitate progress for the other. And that is the message springing out from communities left behind from Detroit to Doncaster. The second is the way in which many experts approach international trade as though, in a sense, it were a game of chess. Economic victory, exemplary in the economic relationship with China, or even applicable to the fight against climate change, requires a series of moves and sacrifices to secure a checkmate. When these economists tout higher GDP, mildly lower prices, which is a skeptical claim at best, a dynamic job growth in tech markets, the spoils only award those left on the chessboard. Yet for nearly half a century, policymakers have been far too willing to sacrifice the pawns in this great game. But a game it is not. These pawns make up a significant proportion of American and British population, and great swathes of the former manufacturing industry now reside overseas. These two issues are exacerbated when taken together. A global economic perspective misappraises industries differently than a national perspective. The Ricardian Revolution reframed how we value particular industries. Comparative advantage becomes the adjudicator. We focus and specialize in what is easiest. It just so happens that American steel, semiconductors, and electric products, drug production, and capital goods in general aren't easy and take a lot of effort to protect and nurture. Reluctantly, every one of these industries have declined in America, while Americans demand them in ever-increasing quantities. Why can't we defend them? Can't we get them cheaper from abroad? For this, we ought to turn to the founder of free markets, Adam Smith, for he lays out clear exception to the free market, free trade rule when necessary for national security. Suddenly, the pawns we sacrificed morph into knights and bishops through another lens. The Western economy has always been the bastion of individual responsibility. The economy was constructed to appeal to our self-interest, and by virtue of this, it rubbed along and correlated with human nature. Yet somewhere along the road of economic growth and technological advantage, we began outsourcing not just our labor, but our sense of responsibility. The modern economy, efficient, global, and algorithmically optimized, has somehow forgotten the individual, and in doing so it has forged a culture where consequences are diluted, responsibility perpetually deferred. Where once we took pride in self-reliance, we now find ourselves embedded in systems that reward detachment. Corporations externalize their costs, governments kick the fiscal can down the road, and consumers are encouraged to buy without thinking and borrow without understanding. And of course, to scroll without stopping. The result is a kind of moral drift, a system built by individuals, but no longer accountable to individuals. The economy has become a machine that protects its own momentum more than the people within it. We celebrate innovation, but rarely ask who it displaces. We reward efficiency, but not integrity. And as long as the stats look good, GDP, shareholder returns, quarterly earnings, the question of who is responsible can get lost in the noise. Yes, we ought to specialize, but the belief that we can rely solely on the information economy and forget necessary production skills, critical for national security such as steel, is clearly wrong. Techno-utopianism is all very well and good until further inspection, great masses of the Western population are unemployed and can't even spell utopia. We get a sense of this concern foretold by Churchill in 1935 in his article, The Effects of Modern Life, where he spoke about the wider societal impact of our economic model. He said, "We are witnessing a great diminution in the number of independent people who had some standing of their own, albeit a small one, and who, if they conducted their affairs with responsible prudence, could live by no man's leave underneath the law. They may be better off as the salaried officials of great corporations, but they have lost in forethought, in initiative, in contrivance, in freedom, and in effective civil status. Now, if I may just for a moment digress to the purely contemporary and the question of tariffs. We are told that the tariffs have very clear objectives. And by the way, it is always tempting in politics to propose the idea that foreigners are going to pay for something and that we're going to satisfy the home consumer through that. We're told they're going to bring in money, bring in revenue, which is going to allow us to lower taxes. We're told that they're going to bring jobs, manufacturing and factories back home. And we are told that they are a negotiating tool that is going to allow great stonking trade agreements to be signed by all those who, in the President's words, are queuing up to kiss his ass. My friends, one of those can be true. But if one is true, the other two cannot be true. If they are bringing in money, it is because goods are still coming into the domestic market and tariffs are being paid on those goods. If they are bringing factories back, manufacturing back, then the number of goods coming in will diminish because those goods will be being made at home. So no money will be coming in on the tariffs and no tax cuts will be available from the money that isn't coming in from the tariffs. And if they are merely a negotiating tool to strike better deals internationally, then neither will happen. I don't know what is going to happen, but what I do know, having spent quite some time in the trade arena, having found myself fascinated by the trade arena. And by the way, when I was appointed, many of you know Boris Johnson. I sat opposite Boris and, yeah, my friend, I got an amazing job for you. You have an amazing job. I want you to be my Minister, say, for International Trade. Go and bring me back some stonking free trade agreements. I then sauntered across to the Foreign Office where the Department for International Trade was then situated, into this rather grandiose office that I later discovered had been the office of the Secretary of State for India, no less. Not bad from the Falls Road in Belfast, eh? And I was presented with this enormous set of foolscap binders. And I found, for example, that there are 9 different tariff lines on children's dolls, depending on whether they are dressed in wool or satin or silk or cotton or polyester, whether they're made of china or porcelain or rubber or plastic. I found it scintillating. And I went down into all the issues of market access barriers, the unfair competition in tariff policy, market dumping, all of that. I set up the UK Trade Remedies Authority that looked at all of these. I challenged why it was in the UK. A brilliant minister in Chile said to me, "Minister, why do you still have tariffs on our olive oil? Are you trying to protect Britain's olive oil production?" It was fascinating. Dumping, wage subsidies, intellectual property theft, the appalling situation at the World Trade Organization with the dreadful slow pace of dispute resolution. All of these things are fascinating. And the West can again play a role in being in the vanguard of creating a new rules-based order for international trade. I have to tell you, my friends, that I am with Churchill, who said on trade, "The dangers which threaten the tranquility of the modern world come not from the powers that have become interdependent upon others. Interdependence by commerce comes from the threat comes from the powers that are more or less aloof from the general intercourse of mankind and comparatively independent and self-supporting." We do not mind if we become dependent on foreign nations, because we know that by that we make foreign nations dependent upon us. I hope that what will come soon is certainty. Business is resilient. Business can deal with bad policy. Business can deal with good policy. What business cannot deal with is prolonged uncertainty. And in the wider arena of trade in America and Britain and the English-speaking world, I just remember those words of Churchill during the war, which apply in peace as well. There is only one thing worse than fighting with allies. It is fighting without allies. And as Mrs. Thatcher said, like it or not, and on balance I do like it, the United States is the only remaining superpower in the world. That comes with enduring responsibilities to lead those of similar values in the international fight in which we all believe. Let me talk quickly about what's happened to our systems of law and order. Symptoms of self-doubt have emerged in the grossest manifestations possible. Our laws are being actively undermined, order risks becoming anarchy, and our culture can seem to be on the chopping board. Centuries of legal process, from advancements in civil rights to established democratic principles, are now being overturned, all for linguistic semantics. We look at what has happened when we have put the idea of equity ahead of the idea of fairness. We see what happens when we have now the new norm by DEI departments, higher education, overbearing bureaucrats, and spineless corporate hacks that have followed without the slightest understanding of what they were doing. We are breaking down the things that matter most in the delivery of fair justice. If in cases where a victim or a jury of the judge chooses to grant equitable allowance and forfeit their right, it is their prerogative to do so. But this understanding is key, that equity does not just expand rights, it changes the ratio between rights of the distinct parties. Equity often demands inequality. The solution when this is the case is to be equitable so long as we are individual. This is why when equity is applied by international courts in international law, both parties have to agree to an equitable outcome beforehand. We realize the immense risk involved. For if I am to take the rights of one to overextend to another, you better be sure the first group gets a say. Equity must therefore be applied individually. But when equity becomes the new creedal chant of the West, the base for mass reorganization, this question of the other's rights is conveniently forgotten. When equity is used by states, by companies, by higher education, for hiring or admission practices, we routinely and crassly erode the rights of, say, of whites or men or whatever unpopular thing we may be now over a completely different characteristic. We have got to the crazy place where the modern militia defends racism to combat racism, sexism to combat sexism, and discrimination to combat discrimination. We could seem, in a way, to be welcoming ourselves to the age of the death of reason. There is also a deeply troubling hypocrisy, cloaked in sanctimony, at play in what will unite protests in our society today. Let us juxtapose some examples in recent memory. In 2020, the death of George Floyd ignited global mourning, morphed into campaigning. This cause was police brutality in the United States and the belief that Mr. Floyd's race was the major factor. I make no moral judgment on that, nor on Mr. Floyd's frequent incarceration in jail or his alleged drug use. Those points are separate debates. The point I make is that this death quite literally lit up the world. We all remember the wonderfully postmodern CNN scene with the caption, "Fiery but mostly peaceful protests," as something closely resembling Dante's Inferno blazed behind the reporter. I wonder if this new, reasonless, permanent, ironic age, that will be the caption as the world burns and Western civilization collapses as we know it, fiery but mostly peaceful. I remember one morning in Hillsborough Castle when I was Minister of State for Northern Ireland, being briefed on some overnight disturbances in different parts of Belfast, where youths were throwing petrol bombs at the police. I was told this was nothing to worry about, Minister. They're merely engaged in recreational rioting. But such was the reaction to Floyd's death that people, including Britain's now Prime Minister and his deputy, were photographed taking the knee in solidarity with an event that they knew nothing about and could have had nothing to do with. Then we look at the regular protests going on across the West in solidarity with Palestine, although frankly more closely resembling support for Hamas. Perhaps the most absurd supports of these groups are the so-called gays for Gaza. Without apparent understanding of irony, these people take to the streets, seemingly oblivious that were they to live their lives openly under the medieval barbaric Islamist Hamas regime, their pronouns would almost certainly and quickly be was and were. The gays for Gaza crowd really do bring a new meaning to the idea of devil's advocates. However, both these causes can shed some degree of light as to how ridiculous our social relations have increasingly become. Each year, millions of innocent Muslims die, usually at the hands of other Muslims. In Syria, nearly 600,000 Muslims died at the behest of another in a long line of despotic Arab leaders. And guess what? Silence ensues. No British or American Muslims lined the streets. Flocks of overprivileged millennial children did not call to arms or take over university campuses or deface statues. But yet, less than a tenth of those killed in the war in Gaza, and many of them terrorist military combatants, all hell breaks loose. Not to question the unquestionably sterling reputation of Hamas, but that fraction is assuming they are not lying or inflating the statistics, a liberty we do not extend to other terrorists or leaders like Putin. All this, my friends, proves one thing rather clearly. These mobs of protesters don't particularly care about civilian casualties. If they did, they would not call for the disinvestment of Western weapons companies saving the lives of Ukrainian citizens. If they did, they would care when other innocents die, whether they be the massacre of Christians this Palm Sunday or Muslims at the hands of other Muslims. It is our irrationality which I find perplexing. It is that currently in Great Britain, we are witnessing Hamas, aided by British lawyers, seeking to petition against their terrorist status. This perverse spectacle, which will actually be entertained by British courts, is allowing Hamas to launder its blood-soaked record under the false banners of liberation and resistance. One wants to ask any of the millions who have taken to the streets to protest against that great evil, Israel, just what bit of Israel it is that they so loathe. Is it their evil democratic system, their evil constitutionally enshrined equal rights, their evil record of success and HDI metrics, their evil status as the only place in the Middle East that I, as a gay man, would quite happily live in safety? When I speak of our crisis of confidence, our self-loathing, there really is no better example here. In a conflict between a genocidal Islamic terrorist group and the country most like us in the region. Yet great swathes of our citizenry choose the former. What can that be if not a proxy poll testing our own self-doubt? In Europe, we have the mirror image of America's struggle with the history of slavery. Slavery has left a legacy of blood and one that you still grapple with today. From the Civil War to Reconstruction, segregation and Jim Crow to Obama and BLM, for better or worse, right or wrong, America continues to confront its original sin. For Europe, colonialism is the opposite of that. The subtext is unspoken, but it's very clear. Every white European must embrace a sense of guilt and wrong against every person of color, even absurdly, if they were born and grew up in the same country, town, or even street. As the European is obliged to feel guilt, so the person of color must assume, willingly or otherwise, the persona of a victim. That much about these historical narratives is contested is irrelevant. That there is a positive part on the imperial balance sheet in the form of democratic institutions, rule of law, impartial systems of administration, and vast infrastructure legacies, as well as the acknowledged negatives, is also irrelevant. And above all, that it was absolutely nothing to bloody well do with us because we weren't even born, is regarded as fluff. And by the way, before anyone here or watching at home discerns that I'm some gammon-coloured British imperialist, I would point out that I was born on the island of Ireland, and my ancestors would have been poor Catholics and likely on the sharp end of the famine. My claim to Irishness is so strong that it would make Joe Biden look like John Bull singing Rule Britannia. Despite all of this, we continue to flog ourselves on the metaphorical sex paddle of white guilt. We are gluttons for social masochism, but gradually our kink is killing us. Our guilt over our colonial sins, our ancestors, is leading to honor killings of ourselves. And this is perhaps the most fundamental issue that I want to address today, and it is the one I do so with the greatest trepidation. If I bear myself to you in complete honesty, it is one of my most profound regrets that these are not things that I said in the House of Commons as a Member of Parliament. For I was cowed, as almost everyone in British politics has been cowed for decades. Let me say it candidly. Multiculturalism has failed. As a project, it has been tried and tested to destruction, and it has been calamitous, and its impact may worsen. Now, let me get some terms very clear, because language and meaning here have significant import. I believe it is absolutely possible to have a successful multi-ethnic society. I recognize it is equally possible to have a multi-faith society, but I believe it is impossible to have a multicultural society. Yet that is what Britain now has, and it has arrived at this point almost accidentally, without ever expressed democratic consent, and with the major parties, commentators, and media engaged in a near conspiratorial degree of silence. In the 50 years between 1945 and 1995, net migration to the United Kingdom was less than 1 million, and much of that number was from the 1990s. Before then, more people left the UK than came in. In the 30 years since 1995, net migration has risen to around 8 million. That is something quite different to the waves of refugees Britain has provided sanctuary to over the centuries, to Jews, to the Ugandan Asians fleeing the barbarism of Idi Amin, or more recently the sanctuary provided to Ukrainians or to Hong Kong Chinese. We are taking in tens of thousands of undocumented young men from the boiling pots of the world's sectarian hotspots, and almost all men. Stand at the shores of Dover as the boats arrive daily and cry, "Women and children first," and you would get a thin response indeed. More widely, we are seeing communities where ballots are filled in by so-called community leaders, housing allocated to people who have made no contribution to the country, hotels, including in my old constituency, taken over from tourism use to house so-called asylum seekers, crime rates, especially sexual crime rates, rising, and even today, news that the government intends to allocate homes for housing of illegal migrants. We are being forced as a society in Britain to confront and debate blasphemy laws, polygamy, child marriage, and inbreeding, practices routine among some of those communities coming from abroad. When these individuals come to the UK, they do not leave these practices behind, and resultantly the Western world is dealing with issues we thought we had outlawed centuries ago. Take inbreeding as an example. The UK is yet to pass a law banning first cousin marriage. It is inbreeding, and it does have a high propensity to cause genetic defects. However, no law has been passed because, generally speaking, most young Brits eager to be married don't ask their cousins. It's a little taboo. Aren't we so bigoted? Now in major cities in the UK, from Bradford to Birmingham, the areas with the highest concentration from the Muslim community are also seeing the highest concentration of genetic diseases among newborns. In 2021, a study conducted found that 55% of British Pakistanis are married to their first cousin. This was even reported on the BBC. Or we can turn to the hidden parallel communities which have emerged in the land, as currently anywhere between 90 and 110 Sharia law councils are operating in the UK. Although lacking the legal underpinning and standing of a British court, if the community abide by them, which they do, they are probably more effective. Even the British Home Office has published a review saying that these councils, quote, supported the values of extremist, condoned wife-beating, ignored marital rape, and allowed forced marriages. The truth is that much of this is culture, and these customs diverge sharply from liberal Western norms. When we ignore these differences, out of fear of being labelled intolerant or bigoted, we risk importing ideologies that are incompatible with the freedoms we take for granted: free speech, religious tolerance, gender equality, and secular government. And my friends, I take little comfort from the repeated mantra that only a tiny percentage of British-born Muslims support jihad. As the ever-courageous Douglas Murray has pointed out recently, even a small percentage of a large number is actually a high number in and of itself. Some of this ideology has taken root already. You see it in the terrorist-sympathizing Hamas mobs marching through London. You see them with Adam Chowdhury, the Islamist preacher who over a decade has spewed Islamicist hatred in the middle of Bury Park in Luton. Everyone knew he was a terrorist, and only last year he was jailed for directing a hidden terrorist cell network. Meanwhile, if you post a comment on Facebook that constitutes hate speech, you get the police kicking in your door. The incompatibility of Britain's Western liberal values and the values of some Islamicist beliefs and customs can be most saliently observed perhaps in the most horrific example to note in Britain: the Pakistani grooming gangs. This scandal, which I'm sure you're all aware, is the clearest warning for the future. The UK grooming gang scandals, particularly those uncovered in towns like Rotherham, Rochdale, and Telford, involved the systematic sexual exploitation of young girls, mostly poor, working class, and white, by a network of British Muslim Pakistani men. These cases demonstrated two key concerns: the incompatibility of Islam and the cowardice of our political elite to confront it. Multiple independent reports, including the 2014 J report, concluded that the local authorities, police and social services habitually fail to act on evidence due to a combination of disbelief, bureaucratic neglect, and fears of being perceived to be racist. To know that the most vulnerable in our society, England's abandoned daughters, have been treated like this, raped and tortured on a scale hitherto undreamt of, has made me reconsider the way I look at my country. For the first time in my life, I felt shame. I questioned my political allegiance. I questioned my political party, for which I have belonged to since the age of 14. I questioned some of my own friends, fellow government ministers. I questioned those great British institutions that have stood like spires of stability for centuries. I questioned my faith in my own countrymen. Even our police have been cowed. As marchers of Muslims on the streets of London chanted, "Jihad, jihad, jihad," this is what the Metropolitan Police tweeted. Quote, "The word jihad has a number of meanings, but we know the public will most commonly associate them with terrorism. We have specialist counter-terrorism officers here in the operation rooms who have particular knowledge in this area. They have assessed this video and they have not identified any offences arising from the specific clip. However, they will identify the man and will be speaking to him shortly to discourage any repeat of such similar chanting." People have asked how this was allowed to happen. How and who is to blame? They blame class, race, and the failure of assimilation. They have attributed the blame to the state, to our supposed services. But it is conveniently forgotten that it is the all-important question of why we were not willing to talk openly about this for fear of what people would say of us. It is because we have got to a point in Britain where the undermining of our confidence in ourselves has been so successful that this is the first time that I have felt strong enough to speak out. The deconstruction of our history, the fear of being called racist, has led us to turn a blind eye. It has led us to abandoning the ancient principles of equality before the law and indeed the rule of law itself. We have allowed the foundations of our society to be undermined before our eyes. It is time to say enough and to bring these issues into the open. And again, as Churchill did in the 1930s, trust the British people and their wisdom to know what to do. Perhaps it speaks to something really fundamental about that little room, the shrine of the world's liberties. Some years ago, one of my parliamentary colleagues, David Amos, was murdered. I knew David well. I thought this morning, watching the funeral service of Pope Francis, of the many happy occasions where we had visited the Vatican as co-chairs of the all-party group on the Holy See. David was stabbed to death in his constituency advice surgery by an Islamist fanatic, not by a nutter, a loner, or someone mentally unwell, but a jihadi, an Islamist. When Parliament met after David's death, we had the most fatuous debate imaginable, which consisted of calls to be nicer to each other on Twitter and Facebook. No one talked about who had killed David or why. Our great institution of Parliament, the little room, the shrine of the world's liberties, has been so reduced. People queue up to put on the awareness badges of that week's particular campaign, read speeches into the record, and issue local press releases. We have been profoundly reduced. As Churchill said, are not modern conditions, at any rate throughout the English-speaking communities, hostile to the development of outstanding personalities and their influence upon events? When you look at the House of Commons today, you have to believe that he was right. My friends, could anyone today even imagine Winston Churchill passing the first step to be accepted as an approved parliamentary candidate? Imagine the assessment board. Tell us about your finances, Mr. Churchill. How much do you drink, Mr. Churchill? Would you undertake to live full-time in your constituency, Mr. Churchill? Would you prioritize constituency surgeries over national governmental matters? Churchill wouldn't have been a candidate in the modern United Kingdom process. As he said himself, We see around us today a marked lack of individual leadership. The late Mr. John Morey, statesman, man of letters and man of affairs, some years ago, towards the close of his life, delivered an oration in which he drew attention to the decline in personal eminence of the leaders in almost all the important spheres of thought and art. He contrasted the heads of the great professions in the early 20th century with those who had shone in the mid-Victorian era. He spoke of the vacant thrones in philosophy, history, economics, oratory, statecraft, poetry, literature, painting, sculpture, and music, which he stood on every side. He pointed, as far as possible without offense, to the array of blameless mediocrities who strutted conscientiously around the seats of the mighty, decked in their discarded mantles and insignia. Those words, to me, sum up where we have got to in many ways today. And he said back then in the 1930s, and even now, the parliaments of every country have shown themselves quite inadequate to deal with the economic problems which dominate the affairs of every nation under the world. Before these problems, the claptrap of the hustings and the stunts of the newspapers wither and vanish away. Democracy as a guide or motive to progress has long been known to be incompetent. None of the legislative assemblies of the great modern states represents in universal suffrage even a fraction of the strength or wisdom of the community they purport to serve. Now, my friends, I said towards the beginning that I thought of entitling my remarks today about the fat lady singing. Well, I don't think the fat lady has yet broken into song, but I fear that I can hear her distant humming, and we should take the fat lady's distant humming as a call to arms. I am, despite what I have said to you today, not filled with despair. I passionately believe that there is hope, that there is a seed of hope planted deep in the long winter's soil, trusting in the sun it is yet to feel. In fact, I would argue that today's gathering is actually a symbol of that hope. Many entities are coming together to fight our decline as we speak. An army of interest groups, think tanks, politicians, intellectuals, institutions such as this very one are aiming to re-inspire the Western world with a new sense of purpose. Yet ultimately, my hope in the future comes from one ever-present truth. The American people and the British people, and indeed the whole English-speaking world, who hold the spark of self-confidence in their chest plate. I know them, I've met them, I've been elected by them, I've been liberated by them. I assert that they are not hollow, just asleep, and that our new great awakening has begun. In the words of Kipling, so when the world is asleep and there seems no hope of her waking, out of some long bad dream that makes her mutter and moan, suddenly all men arise to the noise of fetters breaking, and everyone smiles at his neighbor and tells him his soul is his own. As Churchill said, no material progress, even though it takes shapes we cannot now conceive, or however it may expand the faculties of man, can bring comfort to his soul. It is this fact, more wonderful than any science can reveal, which gives the best hope that all will be well. Projects undreamed of by past generations will absorb our immediate descendants. Forces terrific and devastating will be in their hands. Comforts, activities, amenities, pleasures will crowd upon them. but their hearts will ache, their lives will be barren if they have not a vision above material things. And with the hopes and powers will become dangers out of all proportion to the growth of man's intellect, to the strength of his character, or to the efficacy of his institutions. Once more, the choice is offered between blessing and cursing. Never was the answer that will be given harder to foretell. My friends, it is our blessing that we have the spirit of Churchill to inspire and guide us as a new generation grapples with these enormous challenges. And I conclude, as I began, by saying to each and every one of you, thank you. Thank you for all that you do. And in my favorite line from Westminster, that great British comedy, where Sir Humphrey explained to Bernard that gratitude was merely a lively expectation of favours to come, may I thank you for all that you will do in the years ahead to continue to support the great legacy and inspiration of Winston Spencer Churchill.
Thank you for joining us today for this significant convocation, the 38th Enid and R. Crosby Kemper Lecture. Please remain in the church until the platform party and the new Churchill Fellows have left. I declare this convocation of Westminster College and America's National Churchill Museum closed. Please rise.